The story of urban planning is, on the surface, a straightforward one. Cities grow, populations expand, and eventually the infrastructure catches up. Roads get widened, transit systems get built, engineers respond to demand, and the city adjusts. That is the standard model. That is how most historians and urban planners describe the development of the modern city. But here is where that explanation begins to strain. In city after city, across multiple continents, streets were not widened in response to traffic. They were widened before traffic existed at a scale that would require them. Not by a few years. In some documented cases, by decades. And not in one or two isolated locations, but in patterns that appear in urban records from Paris to Chicago, from Edinburgh to Buenos Aires. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. What it does examine is a specific, measurable anomaly, the timing of road widening projects relative to the technologies and population densities that are traditionally used to justify them. Because when you look at the numbers closely, the official explanation, cities preparing intelligently for anticipated growth, begins to raise more questions than it answers. Let's start with what we know. The 19th century is widely understood as the age of urban transformation. The Industrial Revolution pulled populations into cities at unprecedented speed. London's population roughly doubled between 1800 and 1850. New York tripled. Chicago, by some accounts, grew from a small settlement to a major metropolitan center in under 40 years. Urban planners and civic administrators of the era faced genuine, urgent pressure. Streets that had been designed for foot traffic and horse-drawn carts were suddenly overwhelmed. The response, we're told, was expansion. This narrative is coherent. It is well documented. And for much of the 19th century, it holds, until you examine the exact dates. In Paris, Baron Haussmann's famous reconstruction of the city, the grandes perces, the wide boulevards, the arterial roads that still define the city's layout today, was largely completed between 1853 and 1870. The width of these boulevards has been noted by urban historians as extraordinary. Many were designed at 30, 40, even 60 meters across. The official justification at the time included military movement, sanitation, and aesthetic modernization. All reasonable. All documented. But here is the number that invites a second look. The first practical motor vehicle, the Benz patent motor wagon, was demonstrated in 1885. 15 years after Haussmann's boulevards were already in place. Automobile traffic in any meaningful urban volume didn't appear in Paris until the early 1900s. And yet the road widths Haussmann designed are, by modern traffic engineering standards, essentially optimal for vehicular traffic management at moderate urban densities. This could be coincidence. Planners were ambitious. Haussmann was building for the future. But what does it mean to build for a future you cannot yet see? Move west. Look at Edinburgh. The Edinburgh New Town, one of the most studied examples of planned urban expansion in the English-speaking world, was developed in phases beginning in the 1760s and continuing into the early 19th century. The streets of the new town, particularly Princess Street, George Street, and Queen Street, were laid out at widths that struck contemporaries as almost excessive. The urban historian Marc Girard noted that the grid's proportions seemed to anticipate a density and a mode of movement that the city's population at the time did not require. Horse-drawn carriage traffic in the 1780s did not demand a 30-meter wide boulevard. And yet there they were. The standard explanation points to aesthetic intention, planners modeling the city on classical ideals, drawing on the proportions of ancient Rome or Renaissance city planning. That is a well-supported academic interpretation. But it introduces its own question. Why would planners drawing from classical ideals so consistently arrive at measurements that later proved functional for technologies that wouldn't exist for another 100 years? Classical Rome, after all, was not known for wide thoroughfares. Many Roman urban streets were famously narrow. The wide, axial roads of Roman planning appeared mainly outside cities, in military and trade routes, not in residential urban fabric. The aesthetic argument, in other words, doesn't cleanly explain the specific scale. Scale. That word matters here. Because the discomfort in these records isn't about the width of any single street. It's about the consistent, repeated appearance of a particular kind of urban scale, broad, grid-aligned, with generous public space, in cities where the contemporary population and transportation technology did not yet require it. Consider what urban demand actually looked like in, say, 1820. A city of 100,000 people, primarily on foot, with some horse-drawn cart traffic, and a small elite class using private carriages. Traffic engineers today can model what street widths that population actually needed. And the answer, consistently, is far less than what was being built. This is not a small mismatch. It is not a matter of planners being slightly optimistic. In some documented cases, streets were built at widths that wouldn't see appropriate traffic volume for 60 to 80 years after construction. The infrastructure preceded the demand not by a planning cycle, not by 10 or 15 years, but by what amounts to multiple human generations. There are, of course, mainstream explanations for all of this. Some historians point to fire prevention. Wide streets act as fire breaks, and urban fires in the 18th and 19th centuries were catastrophic. This explanation has genuine support. The rebuilding of London after the Great Fire of 1666 included deliberate road widening for exactly this reason, though the full plans were never fully implemented. Others point to sanitation theory. The miasma model, which held that disease spread through stagnant air, led urban planners to believe that wide, open streets would promote healthier airflow. This was medically incorrect, as we now know, but it was a sincerely held belief among planners of the era, and it influenced design decisions. And others point to social control. Haussmann's boulevards, famously, made it harder for revolutionary crowds to build barricades. Wide, straight streets favored artillery and cavalry movement. This is well documented and explicitly stated in some administrative records of the period. Each of these explanations is credible. Each is supported by historical evidence. And yet, stacked together, they still do not fully account for the consistency of the scale. Because fire prevention doesn't explain why streets in cities that never experienced major fires were built to the same proportions. Sanitation theory doesn't explain why the widths so precisely match vehicular traffic requirements. And social control explains Paris, but not Edinburgh, not the grid cities of the American Midwest, not the planned colonial capitals of South America, all of which show similar proportions under entirely different political and social conditions. The pattern appears across contexts where the explanations do not travel. And that is where the question becomes harder to put down. Not a single dramatic anomaly. Not one city with an inexplicable blueprint. But a pattern, quiet, persistent, geographical, that stretches across the 19th century's most ambitious urban projects. And the further you look, the more the standard explanations begin to require their own explanations. Start with the United States. The urban history of American cities is typically framed as a story of rapid, often chaotic growth. Cities like Chicago, St. Louis, and Cincinnati expanded so quickly in the mid-1800s that planning, in the traditional sense, is often described as barely keeping pace. The popular image is of a young nation building infrastructure frantically, reactively, improvising as it went. But the street grids tell a different story. Chicago's street grid, established formally in the 1830s and expanded through the mid-century, was laid out at block dimensions and road widths that urban planners today recognize as well-suited to moderate vehicular traffic. The standard Chicago street, in its original platted form, was designed at widths that comfortably accommodate 2 lanes of automobile traffic plus parking on both sides. In 1830, Chicago's recorded population was under 100 people. By 1840, it had reached just over 4,000. The street widths being platted in that period were not responding to the city that existed. They were responding to a city that, by any reasonable projection, was still 50 to 70 years away. The standard explanation here is the Land Ordinance of 1785, the federal surveying system that imposed a grid across much of the American Midwest and West. Planners were working from a standardized template, not making independent local decisions. That is accurate. But it reframes rather than resolves the question. Because now the question becomes, who set the template, at what dimensions, and why those dimensions specifically? The ordinance specified section lines and township grids. It did not mandate specific street widths within urban plats. Those decisions were made locally by individual city planners and land speculators. And yet the widths that emerged city after city, across different decades and different developers, cluster within a remarkably narrow range. That consistency is not explained by a federal surveying template. Look now at the infrastructure beneath the streets. In the 1850s and 1860s, several American cities undertook what engineers at the time called comprehensive underground works. Sewer systems, water mains, and in some cases early utility conduits running beneath the street surface. The scale of these projects has been examined by infrastructure historians with some puzzlement. New York's Croton Aqueduct system, completed in 1842, delivered water at a capacity that, at the time of its completion, significantly exceeded the city's consumption needs. Engineers justified this on the grounds of anticipated growth, a reasonable position. But the rate of oversizing was unusual. The system was designed to handle approximately 3 times the daily consumption of the city's population at the time of completion. Growth projections of that era, even optimistic ones, did not typically plan at that multiplier. Brooklyn's sewer network, expanded in the 1850s, showed similar proportioning. And in both cases, the infrastructure was not merely slightly oversized. It was built with junction points, access shafts, and modular expandability that implied a very specific vision of what the network would eventually carry. This is infrastructure that was not just large. It was architecturally prepared for a future load profile. Cross the Atlantic and the pattern continues. In Britain, the Victorian era is celebrated as a period of extraordinary infrastructure achievement. The railways, the sewers, the municipal waterworks, the gas networks, all of it is framed as a heroic response to industrial urbanization. Engineers like Joseph Bazalgette, who designed London's main drainage system in the 1860s, are rightly honored for their foresight. But Bazalgette's own documented reasoning deserves closer examination. He calculated the pipe diameter for London's main intercepting sewers using a population figure that was, at the time of design, roughly double the actual population of the areas being served. When asked about this in parliamentary testimony, he reportedly explained that he had taken the maximum population estimate and then doubled it again. Because, he said, if the system were built once, it should never need to be replaced. This is often cited as an example of brilliant Victorian engineering conservatism. But consider the actual numbers. Bazalgette's sewers, designed in the early 1860s, were built to a capacity that London's population did not reach until the early 20th century, approximately 40 years later. And the streets above those sewers, many of them widened as part of the same Thames embankment project, were similarly proportioned for a traffic volume that belonged to a later era. The sewers and the streets arrived together, and both were sized for a city that didn't yet exist. There is a phrase that urban historians sometimes use when describing this period: infrastructure before demand. It appears in academic literature as a neutral descriptor, simply noting that certain systems were built ahead of the populations they would serve. But the phrase, used neutrally, can obscure the scale of what it describes. Infrastructure before demand by 5 years is planning. Infrastructure before demand by 10 years is optimism. Infrastructure before demand by 40 or 50 years, across multiple independent cities, in multiple countries, using multiple different official justifications, starts to become something that the phrase alone does not fully contain. Because each city had its own explanation. Paris had houseman and military strategy. Edinburgh had aesthetic classicism. Chicago had land speculation. London had sanitation engineering. Each explanation is local, specific, well-documented. And yet the output, the physical dimensions of streets, the capacity of water systems, the proportioning of underground infrastructure, is strikingly similar across all of them. Local explanations, consistent results. There is one more category of evidence that infrastructure historians have begun to examine more carefully in recent years: the relationship between street widths and the specific clearance requirements of horse-drawn versus motor vehicle traffic. Horse-drawn vehicles, even the large omnibuses and goods wagons of the mid-19th century, had turning radii, axle widths, and clearance requirements that are well documented. Engineers and road surveyors of the era knew these measurements. They built to them. And in many cases, the streets they built were measurably wider than those requirements demanded. The excess width in the horse-drawn era served no practical documented function. But when you apply early automobile clearance standards, the turning radius of a Model T, the lane width standards first published in the United States in the 1910s, the excess disappears almost exactly. Streets built for horses, in other words, were sized for cars. Some researchers, when confronted with the consistency of this pattern, have begun to group these observations under a broader interpretive label, a shorthand for the idea that the infrastructure of the 19th century was not simply forward-looking, but forward-prepared in ways that the official record does not fully explain. That label is one we will examine in the final section. But before we reach it, one observation deserves to sit for a moment. The preparation, if that is what it was not abstract. It was specific. The widths were functional, not merely generous. The capacities were proportioned to a future load, not simply oversized at random. And it appeared not in one place, not in two, but in the physical fabric of cities on multiple continents, built by different hands, under different governments, for different stated reasons. Whatever the explanation turns out to be, it will need to account for all of them at once. The word is Tartaria. It is important to be precise about what that word means, and equally what it does not mean, before examining why it has attached itself to the pattern we have been tracing. In conventional historical cartography, Tartaria, or Grand Tartary, was a geographical label used by European mapmakers from roughly the 16th through the 18th century to describe the vast interior regions of Asia, the steppe territories stretching from the Caspian Sea eastward toward the Pacific. It appears on maps by Mercator, by Blau, by the cartographers of the British and French Royal Geographical Societies. It was not, in mainstream historical scholarship, the name of a political empire or a unified civilization. It was a cartographic convention, a European label for territories that were, from a Western perspective, incompletely understood. That is the documented, archival meaning of the term. But in recent years, a separate interpretive tradition has emerged, one that uses Tartaria not as a geographical label but as a conceptual framework. In this tradition, the term is applied to a set of unanswered questions about 19th century infrastructure, architecture, and urban planning. It is used, by those who employ it, to gesture toward a perceived gap between what the official historical record describes and what the physical evidence, they argue, appears to show. It is this interpretive use of the term that has drawn both significant popular interest and significant academic skepticism. The researchers and commentators who use Tartaria as an interpretive framework point, broadly, to the same category of evidence we have been examining throughout this documentary: the oversized streets, the undersized populations, the infrastructure that preceded the technologies it would eventually serve. To these observations, some researchers add a further category: architectural scale. The argument, in simplified form, runs as follows. Many 19th century public buildings, train stations, post offices, civic halls, exhibition palaces, were built at a scale that seems disproportionate to the populations they served at the time of construction. Grand Central Terminal in New York, completed in 1913, was designed to handle a daily passenger volume that the city did not reach for several decades. St. Pancras Station in London, opened in 1868, contained engineering and spatial proportioning that its contemporary critics called, in several documented reviews, absurdly ambitious. The Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851, covered an area larger than any building previously constructed in Britain, for an event expected to last 6 months. One interpretation, the mainstream one, is that Victorian ambition was simply extraordinary. That this was an era of confidence, capital, and competitive national pride, and that large buildings were expressions of ideology as much as function. A second interpretation, the one associated with the Tartaria framework, suggests that some of these structures were not built from scratch, but adapted, modified, or refronted from existing infrastructure of uncertain origin. That the scale anomalies are not expressions of ambition but evidence of inheritance. This is a significant claim, and it is one that mainstream architectural history does not support with documentary evidence. It is worth being direct about the evidentiary landscape here. The Tartaria interpretive framework, in its stronger forms, proposes that a large-scale civilization or infrastructure network preceded the one described in conventional 19th century history, and that the physical remnants of this prior network were absorbed, renamed, or incompletely acknowledged in the historical record. Some versions of this framework invoke the mud flood theory, which proposes that a catastrophic event buried ground floor levels of buildings across multiple cities, explaining why many 19th century structures appear to have windows beginning at or near ground level, with lower floors that seem, to proponents, inconsistent with standard construction logic. Academic historians and geologists have examined these claims and found them unsupported by stratigraphic, archival, or material evidence. The buried windows phenomenon, for instance, has been explained by standard urban processes, ground-level accumulation over time, deliberate infill during street-raising projects, a documented practice in cities like Chicago, which physically raised its street level by several feet in the 1850s and 1860s. And simply the architectural convention of building plinths and raised ground floors as protection against flooding and damp. These are not dismissals made in bad faith. They are explanations grounded in documented engineering records. And yet the researchers who find the Tartaria framework compelling do not, in most cases, dispute the existence of those records. Their argument is more subtle, that the records explain the individual instances but do not account for the pattern across instances. That Chicago street raising is documented, but that similar visual phenomena in cities where no such raising is recorded invites further examination. That Bazalgette's pipe calculations are on file in parliamentary records, but that similar oversizing in cities where no equivalent engineer left equivalent testimony raises a question the file does not close. The gap, in other words, is not between evidence and no evidence. It is between local explanations and a global pattern that local explanations, taken individually, do not fully resolve. There are several ways to sit with that gap. One is to conclude that the gap is illusory, that with sufficient archival research, each anomaly will yield its own documented explanation, and the pattern will dissolve into a collection of unrelated local decisions that merely resemble each other superficially. This is the position of most professional historians, and it is a methodologically defensible one. A second is to conclude that the pattern reflects something real about the planning culture of the 19th century, a shared intellectual inheritance, perhaps transmitted through engineering schools, Masonic networks, colonial administrative structures, or the circulation of European planning manuals, that produced consistent outputs without requiring a single coordinating hand. This is a more speculative but not inherently conspiratorial interpretation. It requires no hidden actors, only a shared professional vocabulary that has not yet been fully reconstructed by historians. A third interpretation, the one the Tartaria label most directly implies, is that the consistency of the pattern reflects something prior to the 19th century entirely. That the infrastructure was not built in anticipation of a future that planners imagined, but in continuation of a past that the record does not fully describe. None of these interpretations can be confirmed or dismissed by the evidence currently in public circulation. What the evidence does confirm is narrower and in some ways more durable. Streets were widened before the vehicles that required them. Systems were built at capacities that preceded the populations they would serve. Infrastructure appeared, repeatedly, in a form that the contemporary moment did not demand but that a subsequent moment would come to depend on entirely. This is documented. It is measurable. And it sits, without resolution, in the physical fabric of cities that millions of people move through every day, without knowing, in most cases, that the dimensions around them were calculated for a future that had not yet arrived. Whether that future was anticipated, inherited, or something else entirely is a question that the streets themselves do not answer. They only ask it, in their width, in their scale, in the quiet arithmetic of roads that were always, somehow, already the right size.